Hey friends, welcome back to our series on 1 Corinthians. We're going to jump into chapter 7 in this video and walk through some of the issues that are happening in Corinth and that involve married life. So we're going to get into some details and we want to go through a couple of these assumptions that we understand about the culture of Corinth just to give us some context about what's happening. So let's dive into the text. Chapter 7 verse 1. Now, for the matters you wrote about. So this is something that the church in Corinth has asked Paul about specifically. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. So something is happening with the sexuality and the morality in Corinth, and Paul's saying you need to abstain from inappropriate sexual relationships, but sex within marriage from a husband and a wife is what should be happening. Verse 3, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Now let's pause for a second here, and let's make sure we don't take this verse out of context and say that this is any way an opportunity for there to be any kind of sexual abuse, even within the confines of marriage. What Paul is talking about is a mutual submission of a husband and a wife. That we don't get into a marriage relationship and then the wife say, oh, I don't know that I want to have sex with you anymore, and use sex as a tool of manipulation. Likewise, a husband need not to withhold sex from his wife, but both a husband and a wife, in the context of a Christian marriage, ought to be mutually submitting to the needs of their spouse and the needs of their marriage. Now, this is not taking something and abusing it and saying that sex has to happen all the time, but this is something that a husband and a wife need to deal with together. And Paul's saying neither one of you are in ownership of this. This is a mutual submission, one to the other, husband and wife. So remember, this is not a wife-only issue or a husband-only issue, but a mutual submission together. Verse 5, do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So this is talking about Christian marriages should have continual, regular, constant, healthy sexual lives. Verse 6, I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. And he's talking about his singleness, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Okay, so he's talking about, he wishes that everybody had the ability that he did to be single and to be working in kingdom ministry. But each of us have a different assignment and a different gift. And we don't need to be worried about whether someone else is married or not married, but we need to focus on what assignment God has given us. Verse 8, now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. So Paul's talking about his own singleness and giving that example. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. He's talking about it's better to have a sexual relationship within the context of marriage than to have sexual immorality and to not be able to control our passionate lust. Verse 10, to the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord. So we see a difference when Paul is talking about his own personal opinions and when he's talking about what the Lord would have us do. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. The context of marriage is one man, one woman for life. Now we understand that there's abuse and there's grounds for divorce, but the whole context that Paul is talking about here is that we don't want to be separating and just getting married over and over and over again. I know culture says something differently. We have a cancel culture. If you don't like this relationship, move on to the next. The truth of the matter is that Scripture teaches something very different. Verse 12, to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. So now this is Paul's personal opinion. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. He's not talking about salvation there. Catch the language. He's saying sanctified. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the believer leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay, so let's step back and look at the context and the culture of what's happening. In the city of Corinth, there are a lot of people who had gotten married, and then one spouse came to faith. So what do we do in that context? Are we supposed to stop having this marital relationship because one person becomes a believer? Paul's saying not necessarily. If the other person in the marriage relationship is willing to continue in the marriage, then you stay in the circumstances that you were when you got saved, because you don't know as a wife or as a husband that how you witness to that person based on this transformation that's happening in your life. You have the opportunity to bring the gospel into your home. You have the opportunity to build a generation of faith for your children. And so that context works better, and you have the ability to bring the Holy Spirit into your home and protect them and bless them and give them a greater understanding of faith than if they were to just leave or you were to divorce them. So Paul's saying, whatever context you find yourself in when you are saved, when you become a Christian, don't worry about all the details of that. God will work that out. And he's saying that as much as we can as believers, we are to live within the unity and the covenant of marriage. So singleness is a gift. And Paul breaks that out in the beginning parts of chapter 7. It can be so easy in our culture, especially in the American church, for us to think that you have to get married, or that you're not whole if you're not married, or if you haven't found your soulmate or anything like that. But the truth of the matter is that marriage can distract us from ministry work. My heart and my mind and my schedule are consumed by the things that involve my husband and my children. And it takes away from the time that I have in ministry. That's not bad, but somebody who's single has more time to devote to ministry work. And that's exactly what Paul's saying, is singleness is a gift. We don't need to shun it. We don't need to discourage it. We don't need to say, oh, maybe hopefully one day you'll get married. But each of us have a different calling. And for some, God has called us into marriage. And for others, God has called us to singleness. And that's okay. We have different assignments on purpose. Now, the assumption in verse 10, and what's happening in Corinth, is that people were leaving their spouses when they became believers. And that's not the focus of what Paul wants to have. The focus of the passage is reconciliation, which is always the heart of God. Even in marriage context, that if a couple is to split and they're to separate, the goal is reconciliation in that covenant, not that they would go off into another situation. So, it's just the command that divorce should not be done. It should not be a flippant cancel culture kind of reality, but that we need to be staying where we are assigned and working as much as we can to reconcile relationships, because that's what God has done for us. He's reconciled us to him. And marriage is another relationship that we can see sweet reconciliation in when we surrender that to God. Let's finish chapter 7. Verse 17, nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all churches. So this is not simply something said to Corinth, but to all the local churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. So he's talking about Judaism. If you were a Jew by birth and you were circumcised, you don't need to undo that. Verse 19, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Don't miss that. It's not what we do, it's how we do it. It's who we serve. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Verse 20, each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who is free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Don't miss this. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were when God called them. Any one of our situations that we have is not a surprise to God. If he calls us to singleness, we stay in singleness. If he calls us to married life, we stay in married life. We don't need to divorce our spouse because we become a Christian, especially if our spouse is content with the situation and working with us through the situation. if God has called you and you are serving in a business context and you become a Christian, it doesn't mean all your experiences in the business world are for nothing. Quite the contrary. God can use you in that ministry field. If you are called to the mission field, you go to the mission field, but don't feel like you have to drop everything to run into some type of ministry. God can use you right where you are. If that's in the middle of laundry and dishes and diapers, that's great. If that's in a boardroom or if that's in a church setting, wherever God has you is where God will use you when you surrender your life to Him. Now let's finish the chapter. Verse 25, now about virgins. So he's talking to the unmarried people. I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So he's saying it's neither wrong nor right to marry. God's not going to condemn you either way, but He's just going to give His opinion based on His experiences. Because of the present crisis, so there's a crisis happening in the church, okay? I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. But if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. So neither one is right or wrong, singleness nor marriage. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you of this. Let's not forget that marriage is not an easy situation. We're going to struggle in marriage. And Paul's saying, if you're not already married, you don't have to be. Verse 29, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as though they do not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who are to buy something as if it was not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if it is not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. We are only on this earth for a very short period of time. I know it feels like an eternity when we're on it, and that time goes so slow, especially when we're young. But the truth of the matter is that our lives here are just a tiny little blip in the span of eternity. And so we want to make sure that we get as much kingdom work done as possible. 32, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you. Okay, we have freedom in this. This is not to bind us, but so that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if his passions are too strong, and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. Verse 37, but the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So there is a situation happening in the Church of Corinth, and they're struggling with, do we leave our spouse now that we have become a Christian? Do we get married if we're a Christian? What does God want us to do? The truth of the matter is, singleness is a gift and marriage is a gift, and they both have struggles and they both have problems. There are advantages and there are disadvantages to both situations in life. And we don't do wrong or we don't do right by picking one over the other. But to each of us, God has assigned something specific for ministry and something specific for our family lives. And it's our job to figure out, God, what have you assigned me to? What can I handle? What do I want? And then to walk in that in freedom. And so I hope that helps you understand a little bit about marriage context, knowing that this is specific to things happening in the church in Corinth, but it's also applicable to us today as Christians. So we'll jump into chapter 8 in our next video.